Morning, everyone. I thought we'll cut to the quick and get to the speaking part because there's very little time. We have 7 distinguished speakers. But before we begin with the first, and I'm not going to take all the time if I introduce them with a very detailed bio that they have, we'll eat up the 1 hour. So I'm requesting you all to read the bios that are already present in your folders. And also to the speakers, a suggestion that since we are in the post-euphoria of the Narendra Modi Barack Obama summit, which I happen to cover for my newspaper, and several important announcements have been made on energy cooperation between the 2 countries. I'm not sure if all of you all have followed this or absorbed that. A lot of them, government, I'm sure, know what is happening. But maybe we could, instead of having set-piece speeches, each of the speakers could speak for about 3 minutes or 4 minutes. And the request is if you can get very topical, since I'm a newsman, on specifically what this new agreement or some of the provisions of the old agreements that have been modified and enhanced mean, and how this is going to change the partnership between the 2 countries, which is the theme of this session. So may I begin with first Dr. R.K. Pachauri, who's president of TERI North America and Director General of TERI as well, and very distinguished climatologist.
Thank you very much, Raj. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to start with a special welcome for President Peter Salovey of Yale University. We're delighted that Yale has... We're delighted that Yale continues partnership with us on this extremely important event. And just a while ago, we had a discussion on the Obama-Modi meeting and what came of it. And we were, in a very selfish way, congratulating ourselves that the agenda that TERI North America and Yale have been following in this summit is now finding its way into the White House communique, summarizing the discussions between the 2 leaders. Just to talk about what came out of this summit, which really gives us an opportunity to build on some of the professional content of what should define the relationship between the US and India. What they talked about was nuclear energy, of course, and that's something that India has been pursuing for a while. Energy access was talked about. This is something on which, may I say, that TERI has been in the lead for a number of years. We've been deeply concerned about the fact that there are 1.3 billion people in the world who have no access to electricity, and more than twice the number that uses very poor quality and inferior biomass for cooking in their homes, all of which has terrible implications for the indoor air quality and human health. Then they also talked about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, focusing on energy security, clean energy, and climate change. I want to mention to this august audience that since the new government has taken office, we have been working with at least 4 of the ministers in the new government to impress on them that energy security is a very serious concern for a country like India. Not so much any longer for the US, because the energy scenario in the US has changed substantially. But there again, there might be opportunities for cooperation. One of the things that you heard Prime Minister Modi talk about in this little video that you saw was the possibility of natural gas export from the US to India. So there could be opportunities for arriving at solutions that are of common benefit to the US and India. They talked about the Energy Smart Cities Partnership, and I want to mention that the Ministry of Urban Development, which has responsibility in India for promoting 100 smart cities, has reached out to TERI, and we are now in a getting into an MOU with them by which we would be their sort of knowledge partners for making this happen. And I think to link up with US organizations would be extremely useful. There was discussion about HFCs and the Montreal Protocol, and that again is an issue which has been a bit of an irritant between the two countries, but I hope this can be resolved very quickly, and I hope there will be a reappraisal by which we can get rid of this greenhouse gas, which of course is used as a refrigerant. There was discussion on air quality and a US-India Climate Fellowship Program. And lastly, there was also in the communique a discussion, or at least a mention of a partnership between the Exim Bank and IREDA, that's the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, for a $1 billion fund by which renewable energy could be promoted in India. So all these are very positive developments. They are very much at the core of what TERI has been working on, and I would say at the core of what Yale has been committed to. I had the privilege of working at Yale. Of course, many years ago I spent a semester teaching over there, but more recently I was involved with the establishment of the Yale Climate and Energy Institute, and President Peter Salovey has renewed his commitment and that of the university to seeing that Yale becomes a model of sustainable development. The last point I want to make is that we have actually done a major project for the US government, Department of Commerce, on smart solutions for sustainable cities, which my colleagues have contributed to, and we brought out a paper on this, which I presume will be available to all the participants. So I'd like to just say that we have an exciting set of opportunities before us, and I hope all of us can work together to move the two countries, and I would say the world, towards a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Pachi, for that very lucid journey you took us through the decisions that have been taken yesterday. And I think it's appropriate that we call Dr. Peter Salovey, President of Yale University, to give his opening remarks. And he probably could comment, there's been a lot of promises in the past. Could we convert this to delivery?
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. As I think about the role that universities can play in advancing sustainable development at local and global levels, and at promoting a secure energy future, what is that? I think there are several aspects of university life that we can bring to bear on these questions. First one is fairly obvious. Universities can continue to advance the science of climate change and its consequences, as well as the science of alternative energy sources. We can also sponsor policy research to illuminate the consequences of corrective actions. I think it's worth noting that half of the scientists and policy experts who constitute the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are actually university-based right now. Yale has committed itself over really the last 100 years, but especially the last decade, to be a training ground for aspiring leaders in environmental science and where it intersects with management, with law, and with policy. We also have, as you heard, a forestry and environmental studies school that has focused on these issues, I think, longer than any other in the US. There are 15 institutes, centers, and programs directly linked to scholarship and research on studies of the environment and sustainability and alternative energy. Second major area that I think universities can address is energy technology itself. There are many universities devoting significant research resources in this broad area, developing carbon-free technologies, solar, wind, geothermal, of course, but also looking to do research on more efficient ways to use carbon-based fuels, more efficient ways to build buildings, to improve building materials, design buildings, design vehicles, design power plants. At Yale, this is happening in our architecture school. It's particularly happening in collaborations between architecture, forestry and environmental studies, and our new energy institute. A third area where universities can get involved, I think, is, of course, through our educational mission. Many of our students, I've met a few of our former students already today, graduate and become leaders of major environmental organizations in this world. I don't know if Frances Beinecke is here. I did see her on the attendance list. She's a good example of someone who studied at Yale and now is the president of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Finally, what universities can do is become demonstration sites for best practices. And I think this is the area where Yale has been a little bit different than other universities. We committed to greenhouse gas reductions and try to demonstrate that we can do that. We can make our goals in ways that are not so expensive that they're not practical for a university setting. We can also become test beds for other policy ideas. We just committed last month, for example, to doing an internal carbon charge on campus. We have a committee that is figuring out how to implement it. But given that nearly any economist who works on these problems thinks that that's one effective intervention, we said, let's try it. Let's make the university a kind of community that imposes a carbon tax on itself. We can use the revenues it generates for investing in green energy projects on campus. But let's see if we can determine how effective it is in changing behavior, but also illuminate some of the challenges in implementing such a charge. Yale initially set its goals for 2020 back in 2005. We renewed them in 2010. We renewed them yet again last year. We're trying to set an example for other universities. And even though the size of our campus has grown by 12% since those initial statements in 2005, we've already reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 16%. And we think we will achieve our goal of a 43% reduction from the 2005 levels by 2020. The last thing I'll mention, because it is in the news, students on many university campuses are demonstrating around the issue of endowment investment policies. There is a movement around divestment from, it's organized in different ways in different places, but divestment of endowment from companies that work primarily in fossil fuels or just in coal, or there's a few different versions of this. Yale is not divesting per se, but our chief investment officer has written a letter to all of our external endowment managers indicating that as a matter of sound business practices, they should take into account the effects of climate change on businesses in which they might invest or are anticipating investing, and to anticipate future regulatory actions in response to the externalities produced by the combustion of fossil fuels. And so we will also be evaluating proxies and voting proxies in a more assertive way than we have in the past. So there are actions that can be taken around university endowments that might or might not involve divestment. For Yale, they won't involve divestment, but they will involve other kinds of activities. I'm a social psychologist, actually, by background. I'm not an economist or a climate scientist or an environmental studies policy person. I'm a psychologist, and we're in the business of actually motivating behavior change in individuals. And I realized that to change long-standing habits and practices is not easy, but we do have a set of principles and technologies that we can implement, and I'm hoping that in addition to all that we try to encourage through university leadership, I can also play a role in encouraging my field, the field of psychology, in taking up relevant approaches to behavior change in this area. That is precisely what we must need to do every day if we want to ensure a sustainable world. And I hope that in whatever settings we all come from, we can look for ways as global citizens to encourage behavior change at the individual level, but as well as at the institutional level, for example, the university level, and of course at the level of public policy too. Thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this and for giving a few remarks this morning, and we're very proud to be co-sponsors with TERI of the summit this year, and thank all of you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Salovey. I'm glad you mentioned your psychology expertise. I recall that when the Prime Minister made his Independence Day speech and subsequently to students, he emphasized something that is, our mothers taught us, which was to put off the lights when we left the room. And in fact, after that, when I went around and spoke to a lot of the young people, they've started doing that. So I think, the larger point is if the political leadership itself gets into the act, you probably get a lot more response in this kind of a positive manner. But may I now call on Leo Zak, who's the Director, U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and she's going to be talking about the smart solutions of sustainable cities in India. And that's very topical because apart from the 100 smart cities that have already been talked about, the announcement yesterday said there would be 3 specific partnerships with USA on 3 cities, and US firms would be the lead in these in the development of these cities. So may I now hand it over to Ms. Lee Zak and for her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, as we walked in this morning, one of the comments was made, it was in interest of time and discussion, why don't we put down our speeches and just talk for a few minutes? And so that's what I'm going to do. One, I have to say, as I listened to the opening remarks and the opening video, it hit right on some of the key points that we wanted to talk about this morning. First of all, as President Obama indicated in the video, this is a defining time with respect to climate change and what we can do to accomplish that. The second point that I heard from both President Obama and Prime Minister Modi in that video this morning was the fact that to accomplish this, we have to do it together, and we have to do it in partnership. And I have to say, that's a little bit of what I'd like to take into the remarks this morning, is how we're doing it in partnership. And frankly, as I look down the row here this morning, I actually see how we're doing it. And I want to thank my partners that are here today. USTDA has had a long history with TERI, with FICCI, with the Department of Energy. John has been a tremendous partner. You heard yesterday from Dan Poneman, who is a phenomenal partner with USTDA, and having Bruce Andrews here from the Department of Commerce, and in Yale University as well, academia. All of these organizations are working together to be able to address this very important issue. And it takes not only nations, but it takes organizations. But the other piece that it takes is the private sector. And they play an extremely important role with respect to being able to reach our goals with respect to combating climate change. And that's exactly what USTDA does. It brings the US private sector, US business, and links it with infrastructure opportunities in emerging economies. In particular, we focus on energy, transportation, telecommunications. But today we're here to talk about energy. And as a matter of fact, USTDA has sponsored over 100 activities in India that has led to billions of dollars in US exports. And the reason I mention both of those is because what we are doing and moving forward is something that we can do in partnership, but it's also something that has mutual benefit. It has mutual benefit with respect to economic growth, but it also has mutual benefit with respect to combating climate change, and it also has benefit with respect to sharing our technology and having the private sector and business become involved. How does that happen? Well, one of the things USTDA has done in combination with the Department of Commerce and DOE, our partners, is that we developed the Energy Cooperation Program in India. And this is government to government, but also private sector. In that group, they also have been focusing on smart cities. And as a matter of fact, earlier today, and I know yesterday you received a copy of the paper that TERI mentioned, and USTDA's Energy Cooperation Program has collaborated with respect to this paper. So this is one of the ways that we're all working together. But USTDA also brings practical solutions that involve the private sector. And we fund feasibility studies, technical assistance, and reverse trade missions to the United States. And an example of that, as we focused on smart cities, is that there needs to be a significant focus on the electricity grid and the power grid, and what technology can do to help that. And as a matter of fact, USTDA provided grant assistance to Tata and Tata Power, and what we did is we set out a roadmap for technology to be able to reduce losses in the grid. Now, one of the things I'm really interested in is it's one thing to be able to provide funding for a roadmap, but I want to see what the results are. And I have to say, we have seen tremendous results from having US technology, US goods and service, combined with Indian services and technology with respect to those grids. It's focused on 34 grids. And what we're seeing is that there have been reductions in losses from 53% to 11%. So again, this was a collaborative effort. It's something that's focused on technology, and it's something that we have learned from that we can apply to smart cities of the future. So this is a perfect example of how we're working together in partnership. I think another potential partnership for the future, yesterday in the announcements, USTDA has announced $15 million over the next 5 years for project preparation and for projects in India. That will fit very nicely with Exim Bank's commitment. One of the things we do, we prepare projects for financing. It can be by Exim Bank, it could be by the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, World Bank, and others. So this is a collaborative effort among the US government, and also our partners from India, but even more importantly, to be able to accomplish our goals, it's not just about governments. It's about the private sector. It's about the people. It's about what we can bring, what we can demonstrate is working, and how it's benefiting the people, and how it is that we can work collaboratively to develop both of our economies in a mutual way. So I look forward to the discussion this morning, and I want to thank everyone on the panel for their partnership throughout the years, and the many people I see in the audience who have also been tremendous partners with US Today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. Whatever you said is highly relevant. We're looking forward to seeing these smart cities in India. All we have is statistics in terms of transmission losses. It's probably the highest in the world in India, 30% or so. And Pachi, I might be exaggerating a bit, but if we worked on cutting that down, we wouldn't have to put many of the new power plants that we are setting up over there. And the other point you made, Lee, is the involvement of the private sector, which leads me to the next speaker, Mr. Siddharth Birla, who's president of FICCI, one of the most important trade bodies in India. And he could tell us some of his experiences in terms of, in this brief 3-4 minutes, as to how how the private sector in India could collaborate with the government on this major initiative made by the Prime Minister, and on other fronts as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to express some thoughts as a representative of business, and I'll try to address some of the issues you mentioned. So I'm ejecting much of my written points, and I'll try to just respond. I think if we look at what we are talking about, and it was also mentioned by Dr. Pachauri, I'm breaking this into two parts. One is the use of energy, and one is the subject of energy security. And very quickly, I think for India, energy security is of absolute, it's of prime concern if we want to achieve our economic goals. And this is one area where India and US can effectively cooperate. Perhaps the cooperation can be much higher than that with other nations in achieving India's long-term energy security. Now, how and which form it takes is something to be seen, so I just flag it and leave it there. On the other side, which is on the use of energy and how industry addresses energy and clean energy, I think I'll just mention that rapid urbanization and improved standards of living means that our energy demand has grown and will grow significantly. In fact, our energy planning is based on the objectives of high economic growth as well as providing electricity to all in India. We are looking to sustaining growths of 8% at least over the next 20 years, without which it is going to be very difficult to address poverty and meet our human development goals. Therefore, the challenge for us, and therefore for business, is to maintain a very fine balance between environment, growth, and energy sources. And here, if I may digress a little bit, clean energy is, nobody denies that clean energy or responsible use of energy is essential. But at the same time, if you look at the priorities of India or indeed that of other developing nations, we believe that poverty is the biggest curse that needs to be addressed. And therefore, as long as we do not compromise on certain principles, whether we can reach the 100% kind of, this is a business point of view. That means we want to be responsible. At the same time, we have to maintain the minimum standards, at least, and see what is done in the larger interest of the society. Because if we just strive for a 100% clean energy society and global standards, it may not be possible to achieve our bigger priority needs. So I'm just flagging this issue, that for us, the biggest single need of a developing nation is to provide jobs and to remove poverty. And so I just put that as an overriding concern. Now, in terms of, let's look at the scale. India is the 4th largest energy consumer in the world after USA, China, and Russia. And 67% of our energy needs are met by thermal power. And renewables contribute only 13%. Now, if we are going to meet the economic goals that we are talking about, we are talking of almost doubling our existing capacity of power, over until 2020, for example, against 390 gigawatts of power that we have. Against 200 gigawatts that we have, we're going to go to 390 up to 2020. So we have to make an appropriate mix of energy sources, because we have to be conscious of the environment also. While our dependence on fossil fuels, especially coal, has to continue because we have an abundance of coal in the country, India has voluntarily embarked on developing a low-carbon strategy, and renewable energy is central to it. A few weeks ago, Prime Minister Modi, who is also an ardent supporter and an advocate of renewables, set an ambitious target of adding 100 gigawatts each of solar and wind power by 2024. He has exhorted us to move in our manufacturing towards zero defect in products, to zero effect on environment. Now, this is an aspirational goal that he has given to industry, which automatically implies that we have to find ways to reduce our carbon footprint. Now, there is obvious scope to promote sustainable, innovative business models in the renewable energy space. In the short term, we are looking at an investment as a country of almost $100 billion over the next 4 years. And we are working on a policy framework to enable the same. Add to this another $50 to $60 billion that will be required for the transmission and distribution infrastructure to take the power to the people. Learnings from innovative financing mechanisms used in developed countries for clean technology can be shared with our policymakers and industry, And this can help us learn from your good practices and create sustainable revenue models for these kind of energy sources. India has significant potential for renewable energy development, yet realizing its ambitious goals will be difficult without support from partners like the USA. I have alluded to sharing of information on financing mechanism, as well as we need cutting-edge R&D from the USA. You can also help us evolve strategies to promote transfer and scale up climate-friendly technologies at various levels. Translating this support on the ground will require partnership between governments, research institutions, universities, and of course, businesses. All the cooperation that I have referred to assumes particular significance for us in the context of the recent policy move of Make in India by our government to spur manufacturing and infrastructure. In the next wave, sure to come soon, I'm sure you'll see significant policies and plans in the area of skill development, where again we can try to build in sensitivity on energy sources. On behalf of FICCI, in closing, can I urge friends in the US to come forward and help India in building an ecosystem for spurring a high growth trajectory for renewable energy in our country. Universities, research institutions, and companies with extensive technology and experience globally can and must be part of India's clean energy revolutions. And we would like to very much welcome you as partners in our progress. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Siddharth. I'm glad you mentioned the Prime Minister's slogan of zero defect, zero effect. He does have a penchant to coin these things. When he was in the UN recently, he was talking about the various groupings, which is G8, G20, and G4, and he said, why don't we have a G-all rather than all these divisions? And so that brings me to Mr. Bruce Andrews, who's United States Deputy Secretary of Commerce. I find in his background, he's been Vice President of Ford Motor Company, and I'm not quite sure what the U.S. Commerce is doing on transport, helping us reduce our energy consumption on this very important sector. And we'd probably, Pachi, if I'm right, overtake the rest of the world in the number of cars we might have if we go with the Nano and all the other things we've been doing. So may I now invite Mr. Bruce Andrews to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. You know, one of the themes that I've heard the most about here this morning, and I think is very important, is partnership and collaboration. And from the Department of Commerce's standpoint and from the United States government writ large, we are here to be a partner in helping India to meet its power needs. This is an ongoing, I kind of call it a work in progress, to the extent that I know that India is busily evaluating regulations and incentives and what it's going to take to sort of to make significant progress going forward. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about what the Department of Commerce's role is in both working with companies, U.S. and Indian companies, and also working with governments, and particularly the U.S., or particularly the Indian government. As many of you know, Secretary Pritzker visited India and met with Prime Minister Modi with Secretary Kerry in July. And I think she came away very impressed with what the vision is going forward, but also with how can we partner, how can we work together to fulfill this vision going forward. So one of the things that we're focused on is how do we make it easier for U.S. companies? How do we help U.S. companies who want to be part of the Indian market? But then also, how does our global markets team, which our India operation is actually one of our biggest operations around the world, the team that we have on the ground. The announcement by President Obama and Prime Minister Modi yesterday of the infrastructure collaboration plan is something that we're very excited about, because you talk about transportation. It's not just about the power sector, which is important, but it's also about the water sector, the transportation sector, sanitation sector, and how can our two economies, how can our companies, your companies, Indian government all work together to address your needs. We have a couple other upcoming things that we're very excited about. One is the U.S.-India Technology Summit in Noida in November, which we see as a real opportunity to build partnerships and collaborations between U.S. technology companies and Indian technology companies. We also have 2 upcoming infrastructure-focused trade missions going to India, where we're taking American companies over and meeting both with the Indian government and potential Indian business partners to help address India's infrastructure needs. In order for all of this to be successful, though, I think we need to look at the business climate. And the Export-Import Bank has signed a memorandum of understanding with the Indian Renewable Development Agency to make a $1 billion fund available for financing these types of projects, which we think is very exciting. But to make this all work, you have to have a business climate that's ready to support it. And one of the things is enhancing market access, which is something that we spend a great deal of time at Department of Commerce, but also working with governments to try to focus on, to make sure that companies who want to come invest in these countries, or in your country, and countries generally, but also who are ready to export goods and services, find a hospitable business climate to do that. So we're excited, encouraged by Prime Minister Modi's goal to move India up the ease of doing business, the World Bank study of ease of doing business, because that is something that's important. In talking to American companies, they're very excited about the Indian market. They see great opportunities, but they also see challenges in the market. And I think that's something that we can all work together collaboratively on, because we share the same goals. We all want to see the same goals, a prosperous and successful India with a strong energy sector, and one that I think, as Mr. Birla made reference to, helping to bring people out of poverty is so important, and power is a key piece to that. So from what I can say, the Department of Commerce's perspective is we're committed to working as a partner and look forward to working with all of you to make this a success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. And this logically leads to Mr. Jonathan Elkind, who's the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. And he could also elaborate a little more about where he sees this partnership could progress. And then we would have the round of questions, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. I think it is important for us to acknowledge the different positions that our 2 countries are in as we start, because I think that being cognizant of that helps us to remember both opportunities, differences, and overlapping areas of interest. To speak about this, I'd like to focus in particular about 2 very important areas. One, urban energy, which is a challenge that faces both India and the United States, with different textures, of course, and also the challenge around access. But what unites these 2 different areas of focus within the broader framework of resilient growth and development is the importance of innovation and economic opportunity for investors, be they Indian or American. Now, the United States and India have a strong existing set of partnerships that are addressing these critical areas of urban energy and access. And as a consequence of the understandings reached between Prime Minister Modi and President Obama yesterday, I think we have an even greater opportunity going forward. Already we have had in place the Partnership to Advance Clean Energy, which has had both deployment areas of focus and research areas of focus. Here I highlight the innovation theme and the very important strengths that Indian and U.S. researchers, many of them head of class researchers in their respective fields, can focus on together. We have brought into existence in the last couple of years under the Joint Clean Energy Research and Development Center 3 research collaborations. One is focusing on advancements in solar photovoltaic technologies and particular applications specific to the realities of the Indian and U.S. markets. Another is focusing on the built environment that was remarked on by several of the speakers earlier, looking at energy simulation tools, data benchmarking guidelines, and other technical approaches that can help to make our buildings more energy efficient. And we are also working together very closely to move forward in the access arena. This is existing work, and for example, I would point to the $8 million Pacesetter Fund that was set in motion earlier this year to focus on early-stage, innovative off-grid solutions. We're also working in a number of important multilateral collaborations together through the Clean Energy Ministerial, for example, where one of the initiatives that has been an area of particularly promising collaboration between India and the United States has been the so-called 21st Century Power Partnership, which is all about the both business models and technical approaches that can help to integrate into our electricity grids variable renewables and other low-carbon opportunities that will move us toward the energy sector that we need to have going forward. Now, a couple of the speakers earlier have remarked on the Smart Cities initiative that has been announced yesterday, and I'd like to take a second and put a little bit of context around that before I close. 3.5 billion people around the globe already live in urban centers today, and the United Nations tells us that that number will double within the next 30 to 40 years. So by the second half of this century, the urban population will be the dominant share of the globe's population overall. And with this ever greater shift to urban life, our cities get more complex, more hungry for energy, more challenging to manage. And for two democracies, we see this in our everyday reality already. The question is how one can not simply germinate good practices, good technologies in isolated places in our respective countries, but how one can demonstrate success and replicate success. Here I get back into some of the themes that have been emphasized by previous speakers, and I don't wish to repeat, but the importance of providing good opportunities for investors, be they investors from India, investors from the United States, in any event, the opportunity to invest and see favorable returns. I think in view of the time constraints, I'll stop there. I would just simply note in concluding that the unifying features that I think you've heard from many on this panel go to the importance of good ideas about how to address the challenges of resilient growth and development, basing our efforts on shared goals and objectives, and then building the partnerships that can not only enable our research communities to work closely together, but our businesses to work closely together, and thus move us toward the sustainable, reliable energy future that we need to create for both the Indian and the U.S. population. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We now have about 15-20 minutes. Since we started late, though, I think in terms of the schedule, we have overshot this. Before I open it out for a couple of questions, since we have a very limited time, I'd like to ask Dr. Pachauri first. The question I'd asked Professor Salovey, which is promise versus delivery. If you recall, we both served in the previous Prime Minister's Climate Change Council. There were wonderful ideas and missions that were set up, but we still don't have an accountability as to where we've gone on that, gone down the path. We now have a fresh agreement between President Obama and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What do we need to do to implement these things? They're all great to look at. How do we get down to business?
Thank you, Raj. I think that's a very relevant question, and you're right. When it came to the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which was developed with a lot of effort, some of us were involved in it in a big way, it also required a sense of ownership from the state governments. But in the ultimate analysis, I'm afraid it was implemented with less than the usual commitment and vigor that was required. I think there were two things missing in that. Firstly, each of the 8 missions was lodged in a specific ministry. And to my mind, that was dysfunctional in an organizational sense, because each of those missions really required the involvement of more than one ministry. And therefore, it could have been driven only by the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office. So there was a huge vacuum over there, which resulted in this kind of organizational gap. And the second thing is that I believe there should have been much greater involvement of civil society, research and academic institutions, because not only would they have been able to provide some analysis, some good ideas on how we might carry each of those missions forward, but in some sense they would also have been an important source of highlighting any shortfalls or limitations that came up in the implementation of the program. So this time around, I would submit that if one looks at the partnership between the US and India, we'll have to somehow ensure, and I think given the Prime Minister's personality, he would ensure that he is involved in implementation of whatever is arrived at. And I would like to submit for the consideration of President Salovey whether we could provide some kind of intellectual continuity in monitoring how this program is implemented, analyzing how it could be refined and implemented better, because I think there's a great deal at stake, not only for the two countries involved. I think if the US and India can make a success of this partnership and ensure move towards sustainable development, it can be picked up by other countries and the world at large.
Thank you, Pachi. I actually asked, request President Salovey to come in because apart from what Dr. Pachauri said about providing intellectual content, during your opening remarks, I was wanting to ask what would be the collaborations between your university and other universities in the US and with Indian universities so that we can build the kind of capability that you all have here. Could you all in some ways push this further?
So just a couple of quick thoughts in answer to both of these comments. First of all, collaborations between universities, particularly US universities and India universities, international collaborations of any kind are often best when they are bottom-up. That is, when faculty with expertise in certain areas find their fellow scholars somewhere else and initiate collaboration and then work together. And then you can build up institutional collaboration from that individual level. And we have already seen that. I can use myself as an example, although it's not in the area of climate change. We're talking just a little bit about this before, but as a psychologist, I worked with public health faculty in the city of Pune on research concerned in the very early days of HIV/AIDS epidemic around the stigma of the disease. We knew a lot about, we had very similar issues in both India and the US, and we were able to share scholarship and then do joint research programs that had both a comparative element as well as a kind of global element. And so I think building up collaborations from individual scholars at the institutional level, very much what universities want to do. Yale is in the third stage now of a globalization agenda that very much emphasizes collaboration between our schools and departments and those in South Asia. One other role that universities can play also is as a kind of neutral studying and monitoring group. That is, whether you're trying to get third-party verification of some of the implementation of some policy or meeting of some goals, or just need a referee. Universities, particularly places like Yale and other such universities in the States, can often play that role because they don't have an axe to grind. They don't have a horse in the race, so they can often play that kind of a role as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to turn it to two major questions that India has been looking for right through this entire process of dealing with climate change, and that is technology and finance. We have always been looking, if you look at even the current government's commitment, it says we are willing to do the things we need to do, but we have issues in terms of getting the right technology at a price that we can afford to do it so it doesn't jack up our energy costs, and finance so that we can get ahead with our projects quicker since we don't have that much money in India. Now, I'd like to come to Mr. Andrews first on this question of finance and where can the Department of Commerce or any other institution in America play a role in pushing this through, and what would you all expect?
Well, thank you. So there are a number of sort of ways to look at this, and one is actually starting domestically in India, which is I understand that there are financing challenges because of the perceived risks of some of the technology. So one part of this is reducing the financing costs based on the understanding of the the risks of the underlying technologies. But also, this is one of the the opportunities I think we have. The partnership that EXIM has entered into is one source of financing. There are also various others, and I think I would let Lee comment as well, because I think she probably has good input here as well. But there are a number of other type financing that can be available for these types of projects.
Thank you. Lee, I wanted to, apart from that, if you can respond, if you could also, sure. May I just finish that? And then, if you could also tell us a bit of, and this is my news background, is a couple of signature campaigns or signature technology that can make the difference for our smart city so we can, quickly cotton on to it. So both these, one, what Mr. Andrews had wanted you to elaborate on, and the other on this.
Absolutely, thank you. And with respect to financing, I think a couple of things that we're hearing with respect to financing is what's needed is project preparation in a way that then can be taken to the financier. And the reason that resonates with me, it's one of the things USTDA does. The other thing is we mentioned about being concerned about technology and investing in technology. It's the other thing USTDA does, is that we fund pilot projects so that that technology can be demonstrated. So as a result, the US government is providing an organization, ours, that can help reduce some of those initial risks with respect to the planning and with respect to the technology testing. The one thing that jumped out at me, however, was the comment about cost. And I think it's one of the things that is very important is the fact, and I think Bruce alluded to it, is you have to look at the cost over time. And that has to be factored into decisions. I recognize there are limited resources, but it's not really going to be helpful if those resources are not put into something that can last. And it's one of the things, again, USTDA has been working around the world to be able to develop procedures by which people can look at the best value over time, or life cycle costing. And I think that really has a significant benefit for the future, and something that we're willing to work with potential purchasers on, how to evaluate over time. With respect to technologies in the smart grid area, I mean, the US is one of the leaders with respect to development of software and hardware. And that is a great deal of what is involved with respect to smart grid technology. We've worked with companies such as Cisco, Oracle, and others with respect to the development of the software. There are also numbers of service providers with respect to the integration with respect to the software. So also, you know, GE, parts, services. So clearly, your software companies, your integrators, your consultants, as well as some of the hardware companies.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Just two quick comments on technology and what's inexpensive. Technology risk is something that the Department of Energy spends a lot of time focusing on. As an example, and this is not automatically translatable because markets, of course, are different from one country to the next, but the Department of Energy's loan guarantee program provided loan guarantees, who could have seen that coming, for the first 5 grid-scale solar PV projects in the United States. We didn't do so with the anticipation of staying in that marketplace the entire time. In fact, as a result of that program, then a further 10 commercial-scale, grid-scale PV projects are now moving through financing and construction completely without government intervention. So one point is that as a part of a systematic effort to collaborate on bringing low-carbon technologies into our grids at scale, we need to think about the approaches that lead to replication. And that's going to be so important on this smart cities effort, that we focus not on just doing successful demonstrations as a Potemkin village, but that we think about replication at scale. The second point is we have to acknowledge what's really inexpensive. Now, this country has gone through some terribly bitter lessons about choices that we made that led to urban air quality and water quality assaults on our public, which we would not recommend to anybody else to replicate. Now, that means that somehow one needs to factor public health and other features, including a changing climate, the reality with which we now live. We need to factor that into how we think about investment opportunities, particularly for long-lived infrastructure in the energy sector. So these are two very important areas where I think that we can and we must work very much more closely together.
Thank you, Jonathan. Before I open out, I'm just going to ask Siddharth to make a few comments on how he sees the private sector in India energizing all this that's happening here. Are they big issues, big problems? If you could name one or two of these.
I think essentially the problems relate, whatever I have seen so far, relates on the financial aspects. I think technologically there is no issues. People have put up wind energy. Okay, the driver might have been wrong because the way our tax policies were structured, people put in wind plants to take tax breaks. So it wasn't really for clean energy, but yes, we have clean energy out of wind power. But on solar power, on other issues like, for example, there have been laws about mixing renewable, I'm forgetting the word, the methanol and other, from Jatropha and other things. They were supposed to make renewable hydrocarbons. But those things didn't really take off, really speaking, for financial reasons. I am aware that there was an old policy for solar power. Now the Prime Minister is pushing solar power in a big way. But solar power, for example, had these renewable energy certificates, which really would be topping up the profitability of a project. And that whole market has ended up in a disaster. Yes. Now it will be resolved. But the issue is that most of the problems, the private sector is willing, I think in principle is willing to commit. It sees it as an area of opportunity. It sees it as an area of long-term opportunity. But I think once the financial areas are resolved, we'll be back on track.
Thank you very much for being a good audience. Thank you.